Have you ever grown too much of one vegetable, yet still ended up having to buy groceries? That usually happens when you've planned what to grow, but not how much or why we're even growing it in the first place. Today, I'm going to walk you through how I plan my garden intentionally, starting with what my family actually eats, how we plan to use the harvest, and how I estimate how much to plant. Also, that my garden can support our meals, not just look productive. The very first step in planning your garden is simple. What does your family actually eat? There is absolutely no point in growing something that nobody in your house will use. If your family doesn't love Swiss chard, they're not all of a sudden gonna love it just because you grew it. For my family, this was eggplant. For a few years, I planted eggplant because I thought the plants were pretty and they had these beautiful purple flowers. But I was giving up valuable garden space in my small garden for a crop I wasn't excited to eat. Eventually, I realized it wasn't worth it and I stopped growing it. That being said, it's totally okay to dedicate a little bit of space to trying new things. Homegrown produce really does taste better. For example, for most of my life, I hated tomatoes. So I decided to try some cherry tomatoes because they tend to be sweeter. Now, not only do I eat cherry tomatoes, I also use tomatoes in sauces and meals all the time. The key is to plant mostly what your family already eats and experiment with new foods in small amounts. A really helpful way to figure out what you currently eat is to look at your grocery habits. If you're buying carrots every week, carrots are something you should plant in your garden, and maybe you should think about planting them in succession so that you have fresh carrots coming throughout the season. Next, think about the types of meals you're going to want to make from your garden. What vegetables go into those meals? If you love making soup, you're going to want to have carrots, onions, and celery all ready around the same time so that you can make some meal pois. If you want fresh salads all season long, you're going to have to succession plant your lettuce. You're also going to want to think about the other vegetables that make salads exciting, like radishes and green onions in the spring, cherry tomatoes and cucumbers during the summer, and squash during the fall. Because let's face it, salad on its own is boring. How you plan to use your harvest is one of the most important parts of garden planning. Because there's nothing worse than dreaming about making fresh salsa and then realizing you didn't plant enough tomatoes to even make a batch. If you're planning to preserve from your garden, that changes things even more, because preserving usually means that you need a lot of a crop all at once. For example, if you want to make tomato sauce, you're going to need a lot of tomatoes and probably some onions too. For fresh eating, you can plant smaller amounts spread out over time, but for preservings, you're going to want larger harvests ready all together. For me, one of my biggest garden goals this year is to preserve more ready-made meals instead of individual ingredients. In the past, I've preserved my individual crops separately, canned potatoes here, diced tomatoes there, frozen green beans here, which meant I still had a lot of cooking to do later. This year, I want to turn my harvest into meals that I can just pull out and heat up. Things like cottage pie, chicken pot pie, beef stews, chicken soup, butternut mac and cheese, fajita freezer packs. So when I'm planning my garden, I'm thinking about timing crops together. For example, I'm going to need carrots, onions, and peas all ready around the same time to bulk preserve chicken pot pie. For most of us, especially those living within city limits, we're working with limited garden space, which means we usually can't plant everything we would like to, so we have to prioritize. In a small garden, I think one of the most important things we can prioritize is nutrition. While a small garden might not make you completely self-sufficient, it can greatly improve the quality of the food that your family eats. Instead of focusing on growing crops that are calorically dense, try growing crops that are nutritionally dense. For example, you might decide to give up some of the space you had planned for potatoes and use it to grow things like broccoli, leafy greens, or peppers. Potatoes definitely have value. They are filling and easy to grow, but when compared to peppers, broccoli, or leafy greens, they don't offer the same level of nutrition per square foot. Another thing to consider is cost. Potatoes are pretty inexpensive to purchase at the store, but crops like peppers, Brussels sprouts, and leafy greens can be much more expensive. And that's where growing your own can really give you the biggest return for your limited space. So in a small space, You get a bigger bang for your buck if you purchase your cheaper, more calorically dense crops like potatoes at the store and use your limited space for your more nutritionally dense, higher cost crops. Now that you've decided which crops you want to grow, the next question is how much of each should you plant? And there's a few different ways to figure this out. You can use one or a mix of all three. The first way is to look at how much your family actually eats. Start with one vegetable and look at how much of that vegetable you consume each week. For example, if my family eats a pound of lettuce every week and I want enough lettuce to feed me throughout the whole garden season, I can work backwards from there to estimate how much I'll need to reach that goal. The second way is to plan backwards from a recipe. This is really helpful if you are planning to preserve your harvest or make a specific meal. For example, if I decide I want 20 jars of tomato sauce by the end of the season, the first thing I'm going to do is look at the recipe to figure out how many pounds of tomatoes that will take. For me, it takes roughly 20 pounds of tomatoes to create 8-pint jars of sauce. So if I want 20 jars at the end of the season, I will need to make that recipe at least 3 times, which means I'll need at least 60 pounds of tomatoes. When I look at the average yield per plant, in my garden, a single stem tomato produces about 10 pounds over the course of the season. So to get 60 pounds of tomatoes, I will need to plant at least 6 tomato plants dedicated just to sauce making. The third way is to use a third-party planting guide. These are far less personalized, but they're really helpful when you're just getting started. I'll put one on the screen that's based on a mix of online yield averages and data I've collected from my own garden over the years. It won't be a perfect match for your garden or your family, but it can give you a solid starting point. After a couple seasons, something really valuable happens. You start building your own data. I keep an Excel where I can track my average yields per plant, and over time that becomes my most reliable planting tool. Your own garden data will always be your best guide. Once you know what crops you want to grow and roughly how much of each you'll need, the next step is to match those crops to the space you actually have. In my last video, we talked about assessing your garden for your growing season, sunlight, and size. This is where that work really comes into play. This is often when you realize that you don't have enough space to grow a full year's worth of everything. And that's just the reality with a small garden. When that happens, I like to ask which crop will give me the most nutrition and which ones save me the most money. Those are the crops I prioritize when allocating my garden space. Now that you know how to decide what you want to grow and how much of it to plant, the next step is to put that plan into action. In my next video, I'll walk you through my actual spring garden plan, how I lay everything out, and how I'm aiming to grow 650 pounds of food from my small garden.